Hello viewers, today we are going to study about James Joyce's novel, A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. We are going to study about the major themes and the techniques that he has used in his novel. James Joyce was born in the year 1882, excelled as a student, graduating from the University College Dublin in the year 1902. He moved to Paris to study medicine, but soon gave it up. He returned to Ireland at his family's request as his mother was dying of cancer. Despite her pleas, the impious Joyce and his brother Stanislas refused to make confession or take communion, and when she passed into a coma, refused to kneel and pray for her. He took jobs teaching, singing and reviewing books while drinking heavily. James made his first attempt at a novel called Stephen Hero in the year 1909. That June he met Nora Barnacle, with whom he eloped to Europe, first staying in Zurich before settling for 10 years in Trieste in Austria-Hungary. Teaching English there, Nora gave birth to their children called George in the year 1905 and Lucia in the year 1907. And Joyce wrote fiction, signing some of his early essays and stories. Stephen Dedalus. The short stories he wrote were to make up Dubliners. He reworked the core themes of the novel Stephen Hero. He had begun in Ireland in the year 1909 and abandoned it in 1907 into A Portrait, published in the year 1916, a year after moving back to Zurich in the midst of the World War I. At the request of its editors, Joyce submitted a work of philosophical fiction entitled A Portrait of the Artist to the Irish literary magazine Dana on Jan 7, 1904. Dana editor W.K. Magee rejected it, telling Joyce, "I can't print what I can't understand." On his 22nd birthday, that was on 2nd February 1904, Joyce began a realistic autobiographical novel called Stephen Hero that incorporated aspects of the aesthetic philosophy expounded in A Portrait. He worked on the book until mid-1905 and brought the manuscripts with him when he moved to Trieste in that year. Though his main attention turned to the stories that were to make up Dubliners, Joyce continued work on Stephen Hero. At 1914 manuscripts pages, Joyce considered the book about half finished, having completed 25 of its intended chapters. In September 1907, he abandoned this work and began to complete revision of the text and its structure, which would become A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. By 1909, the work had taken shape and Joyce showed some of the drafted chapters to Ethor Scrimmits, one of his language students, as an exercise. Scrimmits, himself a respected writer, was impressed, and under his encouragement, Joyce continued work on the book, and in the year 1911, Joyce flew into a fit of rage over the continual refusal by the publishers to print Dubliners and threw the manuscript of Portrait into the fire. This was saved by a family fire brigade, including his sister Eileen. Chapter Music, book of Joyce poetry, came into print in the year 1907. Joyce showed, in his own words, a scrupulous meanness in his use of materials for the book. He recycled the two early chapters attempted explaining his aesthetic and youth. A portrait of the artist and Stephen Hero, as well as his notebooks from Trieste concerning the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, expounded in the book into 5 carefully paced chapters. List Stephen Hero is written from the point of view of an omniscient third-person narrator. Joyce adopted the free indirect style in portrait, a change which reflects the moving of the narrative centers of consciousness firmly and uniquely onto Stephen. Persons and events take their significance from Stephen and are perceived from this point of view. The stylistic and structural changes laid down with careful selection by Joyce. Characters and places are no longer mentioned simply because the young Joyce had known them. Salient details are carefully chosen and compressed into an aesthetic pattern of the novel. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moof crow coming down along the road, and this moof crow that was coming down along the road met a Nicene's little boy named Baby Tuco. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was Baby Tuco. James Joyce, opening to A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. The early youth of Stephen Dedalus is recounted at a vocabulary level of Stephen's own as he grows, in a voice not his own but sensitive to his feelings. The reader experiences Stephen's fears and bewilderment as he comes to terms with the world in a series of disjointed episodes. Stephen attends school at Jesuits Run at Colungo's Wood College, where he apprehensively, intellectually gifted boy suffers the ridicule of his classmates while he learns the schoolboy code of behavior. While he cannot grasp their significance, at a Christmas dinner he is witness to be social, political and religious tensions in Ireland, involving Charles Stewart Parnell, that drives bitter wedges between members of his family, leaving Stephen with doubts over which social institution he can place his faith in. Back at Colungo's, word spread that a number of older boys have been caught smuggling, disciplines is tightened, and the Jesuits increase use of corporal punishment. Stephen is trapped when one of his instructors believes he has broken his glass to avoid studying. Prodded by his classmates, Stephen works up with courage to complain to the rector, Father Cormy, who assures him there will be no such recurrence, leaving Stephen with a sense of triumph. Stephen's father's debt sees the family to doubling proper, and Stephen realizes he will likely not return to Colungo's, thanks to the scholarship obtained by him by Father Corny. Stephen is able to attend college, where he excels academically and becomes a class leader. Stephen squanders a large cash prize from school and begins to see prostitutes as a distance grows between him and his drunkard father. Stephen Dedalus has an aesthetic affinity along Dollymount Strand. As Stephen abandons himself to sensual pleasures, his class is taken on a religious retreat where the boys sit through sermons. Stephen pays attention especially to sermons on pride, guilt, punishment and the last judgment. He feels the words directed at himself and overwhelmed comes to desires forgiveness. Overjoyed at his return to the church, he devotes himself to acts of repentance, though they soon devolve to mere acts of routine with his thought elsewhere than on spiritual matters. His devotion comes to the attention of Jesuits, and they encourage him to consider entering the Jesuit priesthood. Stephen takes time to consider, during which he has a crisis of faith, a conflict between himself, the spiritual belief, and his aesthetic ambitions. Along Dollymount Strand, he spots a girl wading, as he has an epiphany in which he is to overcome with the desire to find a way to express her beauty with his writings. While a student at the University College Dublin, Stephen grows increasingly weary to the institution around him, that is, church, school, politics, and family. In the midst of disintegration of his family's fortune, his father berates him and his mother urges him to return to the church. An increasingly dry, humorless Stephen explains his alienation from the church and the aesthetic theory he has developed to friends, who find they cannot accept Stephen's position. Ireland, that is, Stephen comes to realize, is too restricted to allow him to express himself fully as an artist. He will have to leave, he decides, and sets his mind on self-imposed exile, but not without declaring in his diary his ties to his homeland. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated consciousness. Portrait of an artist as a young man takes place in Ireland at the turn of the century. Young Stephen Dedalus comes from an Irish Catholic family. He is the oldest of 10 children and his father is financially inept. The Dedalus family makes a series of moves into increasingly dilapidated homes as their fortunes dwindle. His mother is a devout Catholic. When Stephen is young, he and the other Dedalus children are tutored by the governess called Dante, a fanatical Catholic woman. Their uncle, Charles, also lives with the family. The book opens with a stream of consciousness, narrative filtered through a child's perspective. There is a sensual imagery and words approximating baby talk. We leap forward in time to see young Stephen beginning boarding school at Colongos. He is very young, terribly homesick, unathletic, and socially awkward. He is an easy target for bully, and one day he is pushed into a cesspool. He becomes ill from the filthy water, but he remembers what his father told him and doesn't tell on the boy. That Christmas, he eats at the adult table for the first time. A terrible argument erupts over politics with John Kesey and Stephen's father on one side and Dante on the other. Stephen is forced to withdraw from Colongos because of his family's poverty. The family moves to Black Rock, where Stephen takes long walks with Uncle Charles and goes on imaginary adventures with boys from around the neighborhood. When Stephen is a bit older, the family moves to Dublin once again because of financial difficulties. He meets a girl named Emma Clary, who is to be the object of his adoration right up until the end of the book. His father, with a bit of charm, manages to get Stephen back into private school. He is to go to the Belvedere College, another institution run by the Jesuits. Stephen comes into his own at Belvedere, a reluctant leader and a successful at acting and essay writing. Despite his position of leadership, he often feels quite isolated. He continues to be a sensitive and imaginative young man, acting in school plays and winning essay contests. He is also increasingly obsessed with sex. Finally, one night, he goes with a prostitute. It is his first sexual experience. Going with prostitute becomes a habit. Stephen enters a period of spiritual confession. He considers his behavior sinful, but he feels oddly indifferent towards it. He cannot seem to stop going to prostitutes, nor does he want to stop. But during the annual spiritual retreat at Beverly, he hears 3 fire sermons on torments of hell. Stephen is terrified and he repents of his old behavior. He becomes almost fanatically religious. At a time his feeling passes, he becomes increasingly frustrated by Catholic doctrine. When a rector suggests that he consider becoming a priest, Stephen realizes that it is not the life for him. One day while walking on the beach, he sees a beautiful girl. Her beauty hits him with the force of spiritual revelation, and he no longer feels ashamed of admiring the body. He will live life to the fullest. The next time we see Stephen, he is a student at the university. University has provided valuable structure and new ideas to Stephen. In particular, he has had time to think about the work of Aquinas and Aristotle on the subjects of beauty. Stephen has developed his own theory of aesthetics. He is increasingly preoccupied with beauty and art. Although he has no shortage of friends, he feels isolated. He has come to regard Ireland as a trap, and he realizes that he must escape the constraints of nation, family, and religion. He can only do that abroad. Stephen imagines his escape and something parallel to the fight of Dedalus. He escapes from his prison with wings crafted by his own genius. The book ends with Stephen leaving Ireland to pursue the life of a writer. We will look at the major themes the novelist has used in his novel. First, entrapment and constraint. Stephen eventually comes to see Ireland as a kind of trap, a restraint that will make it impossible for him to live and create. 3 major bonds threaten, that is family, nation, and church. Stephen's family, increasingly destitute, is a source of frustration and guilt. He can do nothing to help them, and the continued ineptitude of his father exasperates Stephen. Though his father is an ardent nationalist, Stephen has great anxiety about Irish politics. At a point, he says to a friend that the Irish have never had a great leader whom they did not betray or abandon. He also rebels against the nature of activities like petition, signing, and protest. In his mind, these activities amount to an abdication of independence. At the same time, he leaves Ireland, hoping to forge the new conscience of his race. The second, Catholicism. The church is perhaps the greatest constraint on Stephen and merits of its own entry. The teachings of the church ran contrary to Stephen's independent spirit and intellectual. His sensitivity to beauty and human body are not at all suitable to the rigid Catholicism in which he was raised. But the church continues to exert some small hold on him. Although he eventually becomes an unbeliever, he continues to have some fear that the Catholic Church might be correct. Despite his fears, he eventually chooses to live independently and without constraint, even if that decision sends him to hell. The third theme is escape. Escape is the natural complement of the theme of entrapment and constraint. Joyce depicts escape metaphorically by the book's most important symbol and allusion. Dedalus is not at all an Irish name. Joyce took the name from the mythical inventor who escaped from the island prison by constructing wings and flying to his freedom. Stephen too will eventually escape from the island prison of Ireland. Number 4 is independence. Closely related to the above theme, Stephen moves towards independence is one of the central movement of the novel. When we first encounter Stephen as a young boy, his athletic ineptitude and sensitive nature makes him an easy target for bullies. He is rather shy and an awkward boy. The contrast with the university student, that is Stephen, could not be greater. The older Stephen is fiercely independent, willing to risk eternal damnation to pursue his destiny. He is not cowed by anyone, and he will pursue life as an artist no matter what the cost. Number 5 is beauty, sensitivity and imagination. What begins as sensitivity and imagination in the child Stephen eventually evolves into a near obsessive contemplation of beauty and the mechanics of art. Even as a child, young Stephen is an extraordinarily imaginative and sensitive boy. Eventually, these strong but unarticulated feelings takes the shape of a passion for the art. In chapter 5, Stephen has developed a theory of aesthetics that is quite sophisticated for a university student. He thinks carefully and thoroughly about beauty and the power of art, and knows that he can do nothing else to pursue the life of a poet and a writer. The novel mixes third-person narrative with free indirect speech, which allows both identification with the distance from Stephen. The narrator refrains from judgment as contrast. Stephen's hero, omniscient narrator, informs the reader as Stephen sets out to write. Some pages of sorry verses, while portrait gives only Stephen's attempts, leaving evaluation to the reader. The novel is written primarily as a third-person narrative with minimal dialogue until the final chapter. The chapter includes dialogue, intensive scenes alternatively involving Stephen, Devon and Caroline. An example of such a scene is the one in which Stephen voiced his complex Thomist aesthetic theory in an extended dialogue. Joyce employs first-person narration for Stephen's journal entries in the concluding pages of the novel to suggest that Stephen has finally found his own voice and no longer needs to be absorbed the stories of others. Joyce fully employs the free indirect style to demonstrate Stephen's intellectual development from his childhood through his education to his increasingly independence and ultimate exile from Ireland as a young man. The style of the work progresses through each of its 5 chapters, with the complexity of language and Stephen's consequent ability to comprehend the world around him gradually increasing. The book's opening pages communicates Stephen's first stirrings of consciousness when he is a child. Throughout the work, language and prose are used to describe indirectly the state of mind of the protagonist and the subjective effect of the events of his life. Hence, the fungible length of some scenes and chapters where Joyce's intention was to capture the subjective experience through language rather than to present the actual experience by prose narratives. The writing style is notably also for Joyce omission of quotation marks. He indicated dialogue by beginning a paragraph with a dash, as commonly used by French, Spanish and Russian publications. The novel, like all of Joyce's published works, is not dedicated to anyone. First, Stephen Dedalus, the main character of A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Growing up, Stephen goes through long phases of hedonism and deep religiosity. He eventually adopts a philosophy of aestheticism, greatly valuing beauty and art. Stephen is essentially Joyce's alter ego, and many of the events of Stephen's life mirrors events from Joyce's own youth. His name and struggle for autonomy are a reference to the classic Dedalus myth. Second character, Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father, an impoverished former medical student with a strong sense of Irish patriotism. Sentimental about his past, Simon Dedalus frequently reminisces about his youth, loosely based on Joyce's own father and their relationship. Number 3 is Emma Clary, Stephen's beloved, the young girl to whom he is fiercely attracted over the course of many years. Stephen constructs Emma as an ideal of femininity, even though he does not know her very well. Number 4 is Charles Stewart Parnell, an Irish political leader who is not an actual character in the novel, but whose death influences many of its characters. Parnell has powerfully led the Irish National Party until he was condemned for having an affair with a married woman. Number 5 is Carney, Stephen's best friend at the university, in whom he confides his thought and feelings. In this sense, Carney represents a secular confessor for Stephen. Eventually, Carney begins to encourage Stephen to conform to the wishes of his family and to try harder to fit it with his peers. Advices that Stephen fiercely resents. Towards the conclusion, he bears witness to Stephen's famous aesthetic philosophy. I hope, students, you have enjoyed this session on James Joyce's novel, A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. All the best and see you in the next session.